Welcome to a spooky history mystery. I'm Mimi, and since our cemetery tour is coming up this weekend, I thought we might look into the life of someone who is buried in the old cemetery here in Thomasville. While walking around the cemetery getting ideas for the tour, I came across a grave that really stuck out to me. The tombstone is flat on the ground, but unlike most graves, there is a fence placed on top of the marker rather than around it. What also struck me was that this grave was all alone in a cemetery that is mostly made up of family groups. So this left me with some questions. Who is this person? Why is he so fancy? And what is he doing here by himself? A closer look at the grave revealed a rather lengthy epitaph for a man named Samuel McComb. The full engraving read, "In memory of Samuel McComb, who was born in Charlotte, North Carolina, October 19th, 1789, and died March 16th, 1848. He served his native state in her legislature and in various offices of trust and honor, and removed to Georgia in 1838. Through life he was esteemed by all who knew him and beloved by those connected with him, and in death he has the happy assurance of a blessed immortality." Whew, that's a lot to read. Oh, and at the bottom we have that it was made by the Tingley brothers of Rhode Island. Pretty fancy. As for the fence, that must have been added later. Most cemetery fences go around the monument, not straight on top of it, especially not this close to some of the letters. So we know when Sam was born and died. We know where this happened, and we even know that he served in the North Carolina state legislature. This is a great start, so let's see what else we can find. Lucky for us, a few decades ago, a man named Joe Craig Miles went around Thomas County and recorded every cemetery he could find. And I mean every one of them. This book is massive. So what can we find about our man Sam? We'll turn to the section for the old cemetery and look for his name. Here he is, Samuel McComb. We have his dates: born in Charlotte, served as state legislature, moved here in 1838, friend of Judge and Mrs. Peter E. Love. Well, he had friends here at least. The Love family is buried nearby, so maybe they added the fence to his grave. Now that we've hit our traditional sources, let's see what we can find on Ancestry. Through the magic of the internet, we found several sources on Sam that filled out his life story. It's a lot of documents, so rather than show them all to you, how about I tell you the story of Samuel McComb? Sam was born in the year 1789 in North Carolina. The United States were brand new and not always so united at this time, and North Carolina was not a happening spot to live. Sam lucked out in being born into a wealthy family, provided for by the efforts of enslaved labor. But not so luckily, Sam's father died when the boy was hardly 10 years old. The sheriff of Mecklenburg, North Carolina, seized his family's land and property, worth thousands of dollars, for years before Sam's mother was able to reclaim it with the help of her third husband, 30 years her junior. Mom used her inheritance to open a tavern, but that was no place to raise children. The McComb kids were split up, and Sam was placed under the guardianship of a man named Will Smith. Not the actor. When Sam grew up, he was given some money and land from his family and went out to start his life. He married a woman named Alice, started his own farm, had kids, and even served in the state legislature of 1826. In 1828, Sam struck gold, literally. Now, people had been finding gold in this part of North Carolina for the past 30 years, but Sam was the first one to find enough gold to start a mine, and that's just what he did. This suddenly made him an expert on money in his town, and a few years later, Sam was put in charge of deciding where to locate a United States Mint in Mecklenburg County, one of the first 3 in the United States. This picture shows the current mint. The first one burned down in 1841, but a second one was built a few years later and now functions as an art museum. Despite finding wealth and success, Sam was struck with some more tragedies in his life. In 1836, his mother died, leaving a third of her property to her son, Sam. This was around the time Sam decided to leave North Carolina and move to Thomasville. He made many friends here, including the Love family mentioned earlier. Just a few years in, his eldest son died suddenly at the age of 32. Having been a bachelor all his life, as far as anyone was concerned, Sam Jr. left the majority of his property to his father. but he made an important stipulation that may have been a little awkward for his dad. You see, the year Sam Sr. was in the state legislature was the year that the state made a law banning the immigration of free people of color into the state. We don't know which side of the argument Sam was on, but looking at item 1 in his will tells me that Sam's son wasn't so in favor of it. Item 1 reads that the son's will and desire was for his servant Nancy and her children Cornelia and Catherine to be emancipated on his death. Emancipating enslaved people in wills was not uncommon at the time and usually done for enslaved people whom the enslaver felt especially close to. While we may never know the truth of the matter, Sam Jr. felt compelled to free Nancy and her children after his death. And not only that, he left them an inheritance of $500 plus interest and charged one of his brothers with looking after them. But another tragedy struck just after the pain of losing his son. In 1843, Alice, Sam Sr.'s wife of many years, died and was buried in the family plot in Charlotte. Family legend states that Sam made the trip with his wife's body back to North Carolina. With no trains to Thomasville at the time, the trip was made by wagon, taking far longer and being more dangerous than Sam cared for. When he returned to Thomasville, Sam told his friends he wanted to be buried here to spare them the trouble he went through making the trip back to North Carolina. And that's just what happened. Sam died in 1848 and was buried out at the newly consecrated city cemetery. His friends sent off after a gravestone made by artists in Rhode Island, and later installed a fence to keep out the notorious livestock that wandered the streets of early Thomasville. So next time you stop by the old cemetery, wander inside and say hello to Sam, a man who led a life of ups and downs. And if you're interested, be sure to join us for our Tiptoe Through the Tombstones tour this Saturday and the next. Thanks for listening.